Tonight, a major confrontation is unfolding around one of the world's most important waterways. President Donald Trump says the United States has control of the Strait of Hormuz and says Washington intends to keep that control. But Iran is sending a very different message. Tehran says the strait will not simply reopen on American terms. And now, the biggest question is no longer just what happens in the Middle East. The question is, how far is Washington prepared to go? Stay with us, because the next few days could be critical. What Trump said. President Trump has dramatically escalated his rhetoric over the Strait of Hormuz. According to reports published today, Trump said the United States has total control of the strategic waterway and indicated that Washington could maintain that control. The statement immediately drew international attention. Why? Because the Strait of Hormuz is not an ordinary shipping route. It connects the Persian Gulf with the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea, making it one of the most strategically important maritime passages in the world. Any prolonged disruption can affect energy markets, shipping costs, and economies far beyond the Middle East. And that is exactly why the confrontation between Washington and Tehran is being watched so closely. Iran's response. Iran, however, is not accepting Washington's position. Recent reporting says Iranian officials continue to insist that the reopening of the strait depends on conditions being addressed. Iran and the United States have also been involved in efforts to find a diplomatic arrangement, but major disagreements remain. That creates an unusual situation. On one side, Washington is projecting military and political pressure. On the other, Tehran is trying to maintain leverage over one of the world's most important strategic waterways. Neither side appears ready to simply give up its position. And that is what makes the current situation so unpredictable. Why Hormuz matters. So why does everyone care so much about this narrow waterway? Because what happens around Hormuz doesn't stay around Hormuz. Energy markets watch the region closely. Shipping companies watch it. Asian and European economies watch it. And American consumers can eventually feel the effects through energy and transportation costs. A prolonged disruption could increase uncertainty in global markets. That means every statement from Washington and Tehran is being analyzed not only by diplomats, but also by businesses and financial markets. The stakes are therefore much larger than a dispute between two governments. This is about international trade, energy security, and freedom of navigation. The diplomatic track. But there is another side to this story. Despite the aggressive public statements, diplomatic efforts have not completely disappeared. Recent reports indicate that discussions surrounding a possible arrangement are continuing, although Iran says there has been no major progress toward reviving an interim agreement. That means the situation is currently moving along two tracks. The first is pressure. The second is negotiation. And those two tracks can sometimes move in opposite directions. One day, officials may sound optimistic. The next day, the rhetoric becomes dramatically more confrontational. For the White House, the challenge is finding a way to maintain pressure without allowing the crisis to spiral beyond diplomatic control. For Iran, the challenge is maintaining leverage while avoiding an outcome that could create even greater economic and political pressure. The big question for America. For Americans watching this story, there is one obvious question. What does this mean for the United States? First, it means Washington is deeply invested in the security of a strategically important maritime route. Second, it means the administration must balance national security objectives with economic consequences. And third, it means every new development could have international consequences. The White House wants to project strength. But strength in international politics is not only about military power. It is also about diplomacy, alliances, economic pressure, and the ability to prevent a crisis from becoming larger. That is why the next phase could be more complicated than the headlines suggest. What could happen next? There are several possible paths from here. The first is diplomacy. If Washington and Tehran can reach an arrangement acceptable to both sides, pressure around the strait could begin to decrease. The second possibility is continued confrontation. That would mean more political pressure, more uncertainty for shipping, and continued international concern. And the third possibility is a prolonged stalemate. This may actually be the most difficult scenario. Because if neither side wants to compromise, the dispute could continue for weeks or longer, keeping global markets nervous. At this point, no one can say with certainty which path will win. But one thing is clear. The Strait of Hormuz has become one of the central pressure points in the U.S.-Iran confrontation. Why this is a global story? This is also not simply an American story. Countries across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East are watching closely. For international shipping companies, uncertainty means higher risk. For energy markets, uncertainty can translate into price volatility. For governments, it raises another question. How can global trade remain stable if a strategically important waterway becomes part of a geopolitical confrontation? That is why officials around the world are calling for stability and safe navigation. And that pressure could become increasingly important as Washington and Tehran decide what happens next. Trump's strategy. President Trump's strategy appears to rely heavily on pressure. The administration wants Iran to understand that Washington is prepared to maintain a strong position. But pressure has limits. If the pressure becomes too intense, diplomacy can become more difficult. If the pressure is reduced too quickly, Washington could be accused of giving away leverage. That creates a difficult calculation for the White House. Trump must decide how much pressure is enough and how much could create a larger crisis. Meanwhile, Tehran faces its own calculation. Backing down could reduce immediate pressure, but it could also weaken Iran's negotiating position. Standing firm could preserve leverage, but it could prolong the confrontation. So what should viewers watch in the coming days? First, any new statement from President Trump. Second, Iran's official response regarding the Strait of Hormuz. Third, signs of progress or failure in diplomatic discussions. Fourth, developments involving commercial shipping. And finally, watch the international energy markets. These indicators could tell us whether the situation is moving toward de-escalation or another escalation. Right now, the situation remains fluid. And that means dramatic headlines should be treated carefully until they are independently confirmed. The bottom line is this. President Trump says the United States is in control of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran says the future of the waterway depends on conditions Washington may not be willing to accept. And behind those competing positions is a much bigger struggle over security, diplomacy, trade and regional power. The coming days could determine whether this confrontation moves toward a deal or becomes an even larger international crisis. For more breaking US and world news, stay tuned. This is where the story stands right now.